Hello and welcome to Matrix Live. Today my guest is Andy again. He used to be the tech lead of Element Web, but he no longer is. He moved to the crypto team. The reason for that is, I would say Andy fixed the threads notifications, at least a lot of it. So now we want him to fix all the things. We're going to talk about work he initiated. If you remember, he was in a Matrix Live episode recently about thread read receipts and notifications going crazy. And since the team in the Element Web team has continued his work. Andy, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
So we already talked in a Matrix Live about Element Web notifications, but this week in Element Nightly or Element Develop for people who are using it in a browser, there was a huge improvement. Like all of a sudden, my room's notifications started behaving correctly. So what happened? For people who didn't watch the previous episode, can you remind us briefly what was the issue and what was the underlying technical reason for that?
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying, don't get too excited, right? So, Tim, for you, it's got a lot better, but we know that for quite a few people, it hasn't. It's not fixed, right? So this is not. We're not on here celebrating that we've finally got it all fixed, but I think we've made some improvements, and the main areas where we improved are in how we handle receipts, and how we handle deciding which thread a message actually lives in. So shall I just remind you of some of that stuff with the
Yes,
slides that we
please.
were looking at last time?
Yeah.
So let me see if I can do sharing my screen. Okay, is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so this is just to remind you of how threaded receipts work. So these boxes here are messages in a room, a matrix room, and some of them happen inside threads, and some of them happen in the main timeline. So the gray ones on the left happen in the main timeline. So for each of these threads, and the main timeline counts as a thread, there is potentially a receipt saying, I've read this much of this thread, and I've read this much of this thread. And then anything that doesn't have a receipt pointing at it is unread. And that's how we decide whether a room is unread, because the messages in a thread or in the main timeline are unread. And we also, just to complete the picture, we also have unthreaded receipts, which work by kind of imagining all those messages happened in a single line instead of in separate threads. And then we have a receipt which marks things as read before in that single line. And the reason why that is particularly important is because some of our clients, some of our matrix messaging programs don't think about threads. So they only think about things in terms of this unthreaded world. So that's just a reminder of how some of this stuff works. And then just to talk a bit about what we've been working on. So the big bug fix that has taken us a long time to push through, that came out on the develop branch, but is not yet in a released version of Element Web, was a rewrite of the code that handles receipts inside Element Web. So Element Web, when we first implemented threads and then threaded read receipts, we basically had some misunderstandings of how that stuff works. It's quite, in the spec, it's quite complicated. And we were trying to store all the information about receipts just within each thread. And actually, because of that situation with the unthreaded receipts and the way that interacts with threaded receipts, you actually need to think about it at a whole room level, not in an individual thread. So the rewrite of receipt storage and handling that went in a couple of weeks ago, was to have a kind of one place in a room which just thinks about which message is read, which receipts have I got, and can just answer that question for you definitively. So that went in, and that we were trying that out on the develop branch and the nightly builds, expecting everything to be much better. And what happened was the mark room as read button got better, and everything else got worse. Because suddenly notifications were popping up from old rooms that you hadn't opened for months or years. At least that was what a lot of people saw. So what had happened there, which has happened to us multiple times during this saga, is that by fixing one bug, we had exposed another problem. The thing that's changed this week, which I think has made your life better, Tib, is that Dave on the web team was looking into what was the cause of this and figured out another problem that we have, which is to do with deciding which thread a message or other event is in when you don't have all the messages in the room. So I could talk a little bit about that if that'd be helpful.
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, so the spec, which decides how the client and the server talk to each other, has descriptions of how you understand which thread an event is in. And that's critically important for receipts, because if you have a receipt that says it's for a particular thread, but then the actual message or event you've decided is in a different thread, then the receipt doesn't work anymore, and that's where you end up with problems. You might think it would be quite simple, that each event would just say which thread it's in inside the information of that event. It's not that simple, mainly for the reason that we want to support clients that know nothing about threads. So the way that that works is, if you reply to a message and the message that you replied to was in a thread, then your message counts as being in the thread as well, even though you didn't say, I want it to be in this thread. So that was a great idea for helping people who were on threaded and unthreaded clients talk to each other and understand each other. But it was a terrible idea for actually figuring out what thread a message is in, because now you have to step backwards through all the things that you replied to and they replied to and they replied to, potentially for many steps, in order to decide, is this message in a thread or is it in the main timeline? So the change that went in last week from the web team, just after I left the web team, was to essentially, if you get a message and you don't know what thread it's in, to consider it read for now. Like, you basically don't know where to put it. And an element web was saying, oh, I have this new message, so this room must be unread. And what we've changed to saying is, I don't know what to do with this event, so I'm not gonna shout about it. And that's what's made the change this week. That's hopefully made some people's lives better. There are still problems. There are still other areas of the code that are not right. And there are also areas of the spec that need some work. So I was recently working on a spec change which started out as an MSC, like a spec change proposal, but has ended up being just a kind of a correction pull request to the spec, which was around deciding, well, for one particular type of event, deciding what thread it lives in, which is what we call a thread root, which is essentially a message that was used. Someone created a thread based on that message. So in the spec, in the original spec proposal, we got this right. But when we created the spec from it, when we did the kind of formal wording, we made a mistake, and we ended up accidentally saying that the thread root is part of the thread. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, because at any moment, a message that's just sitting in the main timeline, someone might make a thread based on it, and then suddenly it would kind of jump to be part of the thread when that happened. So it didn't make a lot of sense, and it was just a mistake, and no one really meant that to happen. It was just the way the wording turned out. But yeah, actually a few months ago, Element Web found some bugs around this, and we realized that Element Web was following the spec and Synapse was not following the spec. And essentially Synapse was right, because there was a bug in the spec, but we've now fixed, so that's been merged in, and the spec is now correct and agrees with Synapse and with the new version of Element Web, and probably with everyone else as well, because it was never a very sensible thing to say. So hopefully the other clients did the right thing. So that's an example of like a little bug in the spec, but there's also some kind of deeper problems in the spec, and some of this we talked about last time. So in the last session that we did, we talked about it's difficult to know the order of messages, and you need to know the order to know whether your receipt is after or before a message. So I have an MSC open called which is MSC 4033, which is about making it absolutely clear what you mean when you say this message is before this message, by adding an order number in to every event and every receipt. And we also have another MSC which is relevant to the thing that was fixed this week, which is one that makes it really easy to decide which thread a message is in, by essentially saying to the server, please can you figure out what thread this event is in before you send it to the client, and then the client doesn't have to do that work. And that's 4023. So there's some MSCs for you.
All right, so you got a fix in the spec and two MSCs to help figuring out, well, solving the situation in the spec level, plus some refactoring in elements which helped expose some things that were not happening, well, that were happening and that should not happen, bugs that were in the implementation and in the specification, and all that work to fix both the implementation and the specification. So that was quite a long run.
Yeah, and it's not finished. It's definitely not finished.
It's not finished. I've seen a lot of
No.
improvement already, and a lot of people seem to be happy with that. But as you said, there are a few things remaining. So that was going to be my next question. Is there anything you still need to do, well, you or the Element Web team or whoever wants to contribute to fixing threads?
Yeah, so the Element Web team are still very much hard at work at this. They know that there are definitely still some problems. My opinion through this whole process has always been, although there are problems in principle with the spec, the biggest problems we're seeing are actually bugs in our implementation in Element Web. So I think that there will still be more bugs to be found and fixed, but some of the problems that people are seeing now are probably caused by these in principle problems which are covered by the MSCs. So at some point we're going to decide, right, Element Web now behaves the way it's supposed to, and we've decided that we need to change the way it's supposed to work so that we fix some of the corner cases. I also know it's possible that we might look at some UI changes to make it easier to understand this stuff, and make the fact that you have some messages in a thread which are not read, that may possibly not mean that your whole room is marked as unread, but maybe you'd be able to see them somewhere else. But that's just, at the moment, that's very speculative. That's just a conversation that's being had.
Right, and when you say it was in Element that there was an implementation bug or several, was it exclusively in Element or was it also in the Matrix.js SDK that Element is relying on?
Yeah, a lot of the things we've fixed are actually in the JS SDK. Yeah, so that's a good thing to point out. Yeah, so other people using the JS SDK who've been seeing weird behavior around this ought to see some improvements from the definitely from the changes that I put in a couple of weeks ago, and possibly also from this week's. But certainly, in general, a lot of this work has happened in the JS SDK. So yeah, benefiting other people as well.
Right, and that also means that if some clients who rely on the Matrix.js SDK absolutely want to get threads deployed in their own client, they can also try to use the JS SDK to get threads in their client and try to figure out where things are messy, and they can bring their solutions to whether there are implementation bugs in the JS SDK or spec bugs.
Absolutely, and I would just warn you, if you're thinking of bringing in threads into your client, it's definitely possible, but you should definitely learn from Element Web that it was harder than we thought it was going to be, right? So you really need to get your head around what the spec says about what thread an event is in, and you really need to get your head around how the receipts are supposed to work.
Right. And so less bugs is nice. Notifications can be a bit annoying, especially if it's in noisy room. Well, rooms with noisy notifications, like seeing all the notifications pop, is annoying. So when you fix a thing, it's very good to have it deployed. I don't know if you're the best person to ask it because you are no longer part of the Element Web team, but do you know when the fix is going to land in Element Web?
Yeah, so there's a slightly complicated answer to that. So the first thing I need to do is just check the release date. So give me a second. Okay, so yeah, so I check the date. So the release date where this stuff would almost certainly be released is the 11th, Tuesday, 11th of December. So Tuesday just coming. But as I said, there are still some problems that people are finding. So I'm not involved in this decision because I'm not on the web team anymore, but it is possible it will get rolled back if it's decided that the problems that people are seeing now are worse than the problems before. Now, obviously for YouTube, it's much better. For me, it's much better. So I'm hoping that the decision will be, yeah, this has improved the situation and it will come out on Tuesday. If not, it will get rolled back, but the work continues, and it will be maybe the next release 2 weeks later or something else.
All right, and as a user, can I do something to help the team to debug things? Should I send rate shake or something?
Yeah, so definitely, if you're able to use the develop or nightly branch, please try it out. So that's develop.element.io, or download the nightly from find somewhere on the Element website. And the most helpful thing at the moment is figuring out a consistent way you can make unread stuff happen. So it's useful information to say, and you can say in the Element Web development room in Matrix, telling people, I've seen this problem and it didn't used to happen is helpful. But what's even more helpful is I found a way of making this happen consistently by doing, sending this message and this message and this message or whatever it is. That I can end up with a notification that won't go away or whatever the problem is. So yeah, please do try it out. And in general, a lot of us, I certainly spend all my time using Develop as my main Element client. It normally works. So consider using it as your main element, and then you can tell us when things go wrong.
All right, and which is the favorite route to send the problem? Is it to hang in the Element Web room? Is it to do rate shake to browse issues? Do you have any favorite way?
So right now, I would say it's good to talk to people in the Element Web development room, and then assuming people say, oh yeah, that is something we would like in an issue, then to create an issue in the Element Web repository on GitHub. Rate shakes are kind of limited value. We haven't found great ways of putting in logging that helps us figure this stuff out yet. If you want, by the way, if you want to help fix the problems, then there's a whole bunch of tests, which is what we're using to guide our understanding of whether this thing is fixed and stuff like that, which have just been migrated into Playwright testing framework instead of the Cypress testing framework. But in the Matrix React SDK repo, there's a bunch of tests called read receipts, and some of them are marked as skip, either because the test doesn't exist or because it fails at the moment. So pick a test, write the test if it doesn't exist, make it pass, or think of a new test that we haven't thought of yet, add that in there and make it pass, and then we'll gradually, slowly move towards this problem really going away.
All right. Is there anything else we forgot to mention about threads or Element Web?
I don't think so. I feel like I've talked far too much already.
Not at all. All right. Well, thank you very much, Andy. That's very useful. So I really encourage people to test the latest version of Element Web and Element Desktop, which is nightly. If you want to grab them, it should be on element.io. There should be a get started section where you can download the clients. Or it's going to be develop.element.io if you want to test the latest changes. And report your issues in the Element Web room, interact with people, find reliable ways to reproduce. That would be very useful. And that's pretty much it. Andy, thank you very much. And Matrix Live,
Thank you.
I see you next week.
See you soon.
Matrix
Bye.
Live.